can I gather any evidence from anybody else around whether this idea actually is true or not?
But the fact that it has happened to somebody can make me as an individual really, really panic.
I'm going to give you two really practical skills that you can use in the moment to help manage those overwhelming feelings of anxiety and even panic.
Hello and welcome to Perspectives, a series of panel discussions from Priory, all about the big issues in mental health and addictions today. I'm Colin and I'm the Chief Quality Officer for Priory, and we're going to be talking today all about catastrophizing. It's all about how do we understand and maintain our emotional well-being in a very challenging and difficult times. Now, I'm joined with the panel today. I've got Dr. Donald Masi, one of our consultant psychiatrists, also joined by Debbie Longsdale, our therapy director, and finally by Dr. David McLaughlan, a consultant psychiatrist and co-founder of CURB. So, panel, thanks for joining us today. And I guess the first thing that we need to understand, and I'm going to come to you, Donald, for this one, is what's catastrophizing?
So catastrophizing is thinking the worst. So there is a challenge, or potential challenge, in catastrophizing is thinking of the worst possible case scenario, be it professionally or personally. And I can certainly go further on to thinking about the symptoms of that if helpful, but people can feel overwhelmed by anxiety, by dread, by low mood, because as far as they're concerned, the worst will happen. Or we think something of Sod's law or Murphy's law, if the worst can happen, it will happen. Catastrophizing is the worst will definitely happen, and there's potentially nothing I can do about it.
Handing over to yourself, David, if I'm catastrophizing, how do I know I'm doing that?
Yeah, so I think all of us can relate to that experience of catastrophizing, which is why it's such a great kind of conversation to start with, because you'll know if you're catastrophizing. Well, you may not know if you're catastrophizing, but if you are catastrophizing, you might be overestimating the likelihood of something bad happening, overestimating the severity of that bad thing happening, and then underestimating your ability to cope with it if it does happen. So for example, when I was a teenager, I used to forget to do my homework at school, and I would catastrophize because I would think, oh my gosh, I've forgotten to do my homework. I am definitely going to fail my exams, definitely. And if I fail my exams, I'm never going to get a job and my life is going to be ruined. And if that happens, I will not be able to cope with it. So that was my very personal memory of catastrophizing as a teenager. But there's lots, but it's different for everybody. And often you asked me, how would you know that you're doing it? Often people don't realise that they're doing it, but hopefully, I guess, throughout the course of this, we'll raise awareness of what it looks like and how to catch it.
And you talked about how it looked, and I'd like to come to Debbie. What are the sort of signs of catastrophizing? How would you outwardly manifest itself, or how does it manifest itself psychologically?
I think it can build over time. I think people don't necessarily always realise they've got to that stage. And I know that I've heard people say, what does that word even mean? Some people call it awfulizing rather than catastrophizing. But I guess you will just see that you always see the negative side of things. You predict negative things are going to happen. People might say to you, you're always half empty rather than half full. That's the right way around, isn't it? And you just have that black cloud over you, and you just feel like life is really difficult, and I can't seem to get any luck, and I can't seem to get anywhere, and this is really, really hard. So it can really affect people's mood, can lead to depression. So it's when you just notice that you're always predicting the negative things going to happen.
And David, does it affect any particular group more than others, or is it something that's common for everyone?
There's some people, I guess, that are more vulnerable. I guess if you've had difficult adverse life events, bad things have happened to you. I think that kind of primes you to expect further bad things to happen to you because of this kind of like priming experience or adverse life events. There's actually a scale that we use called the Holmes-Raffey scale, which measures how many adverse life events you've had. And so these can prime you and condition you to develop certain patterns of thinking. But that's something that we can retrain, and we can help you to learn new, healthier ways to think.
So one of the things that often comes up, Donald, is around how or could we use some of these emotions to actually motivate ourselves? Can we use them almost for good in some ways? Can we?
Absolutely. So many of our core human emotions are for our survival, for our betterment. We often think about the fight or flight response, which is about an impending danger. In the modern world, we're not often running from lions, but there are other dangers that we may face, or other risks or stresses, be it exams, job interviews, dates. And so if one is on one end of the spectrum, if one is overly anxious, one's performance will definitely drop. You won't be able to remember what you've revised, be it for the job interview or for the exam. But on the other end of the spectrum, if one doesn't care at all, if there is no emotional reaction to a pending stressor, you're not going to try. So actually, most of us will sit in the middle, in which we know objectively that as stress levels rise to a point, motivation performance can rise as well. So that can be really useful in focusing attention, in focusing energy. For example, I need to revise for that exam if I want to get a decent grade. And if I have no worry about it, I'll sit at home and watch cat videos. But to worry about, well, actually not worry, should we say, but to feel a stress, feel a pressure to achieve something, that is how we achieve. It's then a matter of whether that pressure, that stress becomes overwhelming. And if they do, it's about dampening down the emotional and psychological response, and which we'll come to techniques on how to do that. But by and large, stress is positive. And I'm using stress in a general sense as opposed to one having a stress disorder and an anxiety disorder.
And so, I mean, from that, I think that's really interesting in terms of, we've talked catastrophizing almost in its isolation, although we touched on a little bit earlier on about its relationship to other issues and other concerns. And I'd be interested to get your views, David, about what does that look? How does catastrophizing, is it a symptom of other conditions? Is it something by itself? Is it part of a wider sort of pattern of symptoms and conditions and worries that people should have? So how does it all fit into the whole mental health sphere?
A lot of the time when we look at mental health problems, we talk about the cognitive symptoms. And the cognitive symptoms is the way that we think. So that's the catastrophizing is a cognitive element, but there's also the emotional element, so how we feel. So you might feel anxious, you might feel sad, you might feel low or hopeless, but it's a feeling. And there's also physical symptoms as well. So Debbie touched upon this as well earlier, that kind of that physical sensation of anxiety, maybe sweating, having a tremor, palpitations, feeling your stomach fluttering. So where does catastrophization sit in the mental health sphere? It's one of the cognitive symptoms, but it sits alongside the emotional symptoms and also the physical symptoms.
And it leads me on to that further question, and Debbie, I'm going to come to you on this, is if we all experience it, and we all experience it at different times, and I guess our life circumstances might dictate some of that, when does it become a problem? What's the signs that it's becoming too much of a challenge?
I think it's quite complex and down to people's personalities maybe and their ability to hold information or stress or demands of life. It can be family, it can be work. So I think that one person might be able to, do all of this and not be overwhelmed and catastrophize, and that's fine for them. But the next person might look at them and think, gosh, I want to be like them, but I couldn't do that because I would get overwhelmed. So I think it's a very individual thing. People have to know their own boundaries and their own limits. So I think that the signs that you're, even just listening to you talking about what you were just saying, then I could feel my heart rate rising a little bit. And I was starting to feel overwhelmed about all the problems. And I was like, oh my gosh. So that will be a sign that you're entering into that zone, that your heart rate's going up, you're feeling a bit panicky about your thoughts, and you can't grab them and you can't bring them down into individual thoughts. When your mind starts racing and you just can't separate what you want to think about as one by one. So it's when you, when everything becomes too much collectively and then everything is difficult. Everything, crossing the road is difficult, or making dinner is difficult. And you then begin catastrophizing about everything, and you've lost your control. It's a big word to use, but you've lost your control of your day-to-day operations, if you like. So I think it can very easily come in. And I think social media, you know, I can be on my Instagram and I look at one thing and then it tells me it feeds more of that to me. I don't want to see more car crashes or whatever I've just had to look at, but actually I don't seem to be able to have the option, and then it can make me feel quite overwhelmed. So I think there are many things for us to be aware of that we have to manage consciously that are offered to us.
Brilliant, thank you. So we need to kind of move this now, I think, to think about what do people need to do about it? How can they do about it? Because it's as we said, it's something that people can experience at different times in different ways, probably at different severities as well. It can probably be very minor, but also sometimes, I'm sure, the example you gave, like, all-encompassing as well, when it becomes to a negative position. So the bit for me to kind of understand is, well, so what? Do we have to put up with it, or is there something that we can do around it? Is there treatments that are available? Donald, over to yourself first. What can people do?
So, thank you, Dave, for that very useful summary of the thoughts, the feelings, and the physical symptoms. In terms of what treatments people can receive, it really depends on the severity of the problem. And by severity, I'm thinking of the impact, the level of distress, the reduced level of general functioning, which may be social functioning, occupational functioning, day-to-day management of self-care. And if there's a problem, if dare I say an anxiety problem, it's worth getting appropriate support, which is first of all potentially seeking professional help, a discussion with the GP about what options are available locally, be it psychological therapies, medication, area-field specialist services. I'm thinking about catastrophization as a symptom of possible mental disorders, and there's several which come to mind, which, for example, include body dysmorphia. So person X worries that they have a skin blemish, and if they go to work with a skin blemish, everyone will think that they're terrible. They're going to have problems at work. They're going to lose their jobs. They're going to be homeless. So you can see the escalation of thoughts there. But the underlying issue then is the misperception of one's own physical form. So then treatment would be catered towards that, which may well be a combination of medication, which can be prescribed by a GP or a psychiatrist, or psychological therapies, even better in combination.
Brilliant, thank you. And I'm going to go to Debbie because I really want to explore that therapy piece now as well. What sort of therapies are available for people? What do they look like? How would someone receive them? How involved? What's there?
So I think if we assume it's straightforward reason, i.e. nothing trauma, etc. behind, then cognitive behaviour therapy is generally a really helpful structure to lean on in terms of what do I do when this happens. So if you go back to your statement around thoughts are not facts, they're ideas. So these ideas that are in my head, my can't even say the word.
No, I know, I can't say it.
I can't say it. My awfulizing thoughts, that other word, are making me think this, therefore I'm feeling that. So one of the strategies would be, well, let's take a breath, let's halt, let's stop, let's take a moment to sit back and just challenge that a little bit, because it's only an idea, it's not a fact. And can I gather any evidence from anybody else around whether this idea actually is true or not? So is it true that every time I walk into the room, everyone's going to look at me and think that I'm awful? Can I maybe check that idea out by asking some questions? Or is it true that every time I go out, it's going to rain? Can I maybe have a little diary where I maybe know what the weather was like each day? So it's making it into specific thoughts that you maybe want to start gathering evidence and challenging. And that might be an idea to offer you some suggestions that maybe my idea is catastrophizing, I got it next time, and therefore can I unpick that a bit?
Brilliant, thank you. David, one of the things that we talked about earlier on was around some of those longer term treatments. We talked about CBT, we talked about the option of augmenting that with medication. But I guess for a number of our viewers, the question is going to be about what can I do in the here and now? What can I do if I'm feeling those impending feelings of catastrophization and the worry and it's getting out of hand, is there a couple of things that you would recommend that people could just do immediately?
Yeah, there's two things that I like to recommend. So I'm going to give you two really practical skills that you can use in the moment to help manage those overwhelming feelings of anxiety and even panic. So the first is a grounding exercise, and it's called the 5 senses. So when we're feeling really anxious or feeling really low, often it's because we're anticipating something negative happening in the future, or we're ruminating over something negative that's happened in the past. And grounding is when we bring ourselves into the here and now, away from those negative predictions that might happen in the future, those anxious thoughts and those negative things that may have happened in the past. So it's about grounding ourselves in the here and now. So often I'll start with asking patients to take a big deep breath, sit squarely in your chair, feet planted, grounded on the floor. And then I ask patients to go through their 5 senses with me. And I want them to pick something in the room that they can see with their eyes and explore that object with a real sense of curiosity, as if you've never seen that object before. How would you describe that to somebody? What is it that you notice about the way that the light reflects off of it? The colour, the lines, are they curved? Are they sharp? What do you notice visually about this one object? And really draw the focus of your attention onto this object. And your mind might wander, and you might start thinking about things that are happening in the future, or things that have happened in the past again, and that's okay, because that's just what your mind does. It's going to wander. But when that happens, just notice that your mind is wandering, and then bring it back to right here, right now, back to this very real object that's in front of you, the one that you're exploring visually with the first of your senses, your sense of sight. Next sense, hearing. So sense of hearing. And again, it's about bringing the focus of your attention into the room right here now. What can you hear? And if you really, really pay attention, what are the sounds that are around you? You might be surprised what you can hear. It might be the clock ticking or the sound of your own breath. But really listen to what's happening. The next sense, the sense of touch. So what can you feel in the room around you? So for me right now, I can feel the cold metal chair, and I can feel the hard, firm ground underneath my feet. And again, I'm exploring this with a real sense of curiosity, as if I was to describe it to somebody from a different planet that had never felt a cold metal chair before. And again, it's bringing me into the here and now. Then the fourth sense, the sense of smell, and I'm going to combine smell and taste together. But what do you notice about the smells or tastes in your mouth? And if that's difficult, maybe you think about the kind of the sensation of the air going through your nose or the moisture in your mouth. What do you notice about that? And then, because I always like to finish on a positive, the final sense is a sense of gratitude. So one thing that you feel grateful for right now, and it can be something really small, it doesn't have to be a big thing. But the whole point of this exercise, the 5 senses exercise, is it's really easy to remember. You've got 5 fingers. But it brings you into the here and now, and it grounds you in this very, very moment. And it changes the focus of your attention from all of these other distractions which might be causing distress or anxiety or worries. And it just gives you that kind of moment of peace and calmness. And you can do it anywhere. You don't need any tools or any, no medication, no side effects. It's just a really helpful thing which a lot of my patients, and I use it as well, because I get nervous when I'm doing public speaking. I really like breathing exercises because I think it's a really practical way to manage anxiety or distress, especially when we're in that fight or flight mode, when your heart's beating really fast or you're hyperventilating, maybe your hands are sweating. And that's because your brain is telling your body that you are in danger and that you need to escape or fight or flight. And the way that your brain tells your body is through this nerve called the cranial nerve. It's a really interesting nerve because it goes all the way from the brain all the way to the body. It's one of only 12 cranial nerves.
The vagus nerve.
The vagus nerve, yes, indeed. And some people have described the vagus nerve a bit like the remote controller to the brain, from the brain to the body, because the brain communicates to the body. But what people are increasingly understanding is that the body can speak back to the brain through this remote controller nerve. And one of the ways that we can do that is by controlling our breathing, by taking these really deep, long belly breaths.
Now, as part of this, we sourced some questions from our viewers, and I think it'd be really helpful just to run through some of those, just to put you a little bit on the spot. But I think they're really interesting in terms of the content of the questions that we've had today. So, Donald, I'm going to come to you first with the first question here. So this came from Will, and I think this is really interesting because I think this goes to, and we've already referenced this around how social media operates, how the internet operates, how that activity and our access to it. So this is the question. The news cycle can be the cause of anxiety with what feels like it's endless negativity, but I don't want to avoid it. How can I consume a negative news story but not let it get me down so much? Or should I approach news in a completely different way?
Oh, that's a great question. How can I approach a negative news story and not be affected by it too much? Really key underlying point is the news is built on negativity. I wish I could have money in my pocket to provide a good news channel, but it may not necessarily develop much money, because we know through data released by Meta, Facebook, Twitter, etc., that these platforms generate revenue by negative news, by negativity, because for lots and lots of different reasons. So how can Will consume negative media and not be affected by it? One is to limit to limit exposure in a given point of time. So one may read one article about a particular tragedy, and that can lead to serial searches on content related to that particular tragedy, or a rabbit hole of what else is going wrong with the world. And before you know it, it can be 3 hours have passed. So it's important to be connected to the world around us. So if it's about being in touch with current affairs, maybe limit it to 10-15 minutes, if possible. In terms of not being affected by it, let me think of an example such as a murder. So a member of the public has murdered a stranger, and for the individual that can be terrifying, because you think actually that could have happened to me, or it could happen to a loved one. I mean, it's 1 in a million chance it would happen, but the fact that it has happened to somebody can make that me as an individual really, really panicked. So then it's about remembering that actually I am by and large safe. These things are a rare event, and the news typically talks about rare or serious events that need not necessarily affect you in the moment.
How do people get that balance? Because there is a balance to be had, isn't there, about how do we make sure that we're informed? How do we make sure that we understand? How do we make sure we don't close ourselves off from society, but still digest safely and appropriately those sorts of information? So, Debbie, your view, how do you get the balance?
I think it's a really important thing to think about. And again, you've got to be in the driving seat of your own life, and you've got to be deciding what you're going to expose yourself to and what you're going to, when you know you've had enough. So again, I guess it comes down to, again, that self-management and knowing yourself and when you've had enough. And watching an hour of something negative that's reasonably low level might be very different to watching 5 minutes something that's very triggering for you personally on the news. So you've got to be aware of your own relationship with the topic as well from your own life story. Again, it's managing it. It's putting time limits. You mentioned that earlier. I have a time limit on my Instagram because I need to manage that. Choosing, I've had enough of this, or I need to go and do something different. and reflecting. People do mood diaries where they reflect on the end of the day. They might do 3 things they're grateful for and how's my mood doing. And if you notice that your mood is always really low at night time, which then impacts on your sleep and then makes you think negatively afterwards because of sleep deprivation or because you've been dreaming about some really complex stuff, then let's make some changes and let's manage that ourselves. So it's down to self-management and awareness again, I think. But you have to navigate it yourself and be aware of the impact things are having on you.
Thank you. David, finally over to you, your views on how to get that balance right.
I guess the only new things I suppose I'd add to that conversation about how to get that balance with consuming media in a kind of sensible way, or particularly kind of news which can be anxiety provoking, is actually thinking about, well, one, the frequency that you're checking the news, because I have had patients who are checking the news all the time, multiple times per day, and that can be problematic. And then the other thing is actually one of the crew member had brought this up. It's the timing. It's the timing of when you're checking the news and when you're checking media, because they were actually talking about checking the news late at night before you go to bed, and actually that's maybe a time when you want to be relaxing, resting, getting ready to sleep, and not priming yourself to be worrying and having ruminating thoughts or nightmares. So yeah, I guess the new things I'd add to that conversation about frequency of kind of consuming media and news, and also the timing.
I guess there's also something in that about actually not becoming desensitized to those things, because actually if you're watching something that is difficult and challenging, then it is about how you manage that, because what you don't want to do is watch it to a degree where you just blank any emotion around it, because that in itself it could be a very difficult situation to get yourself into. Okay, thank you. Next question, and I'm going to come to Debbie for this one. So Becky's asked, I've got a friend who struggles with thinking the worst all the time. How can I help them? It feels like saying it's not that bad doesn't help that much.
Yeah, I think I've got a friend actually who catastrophizes, and I have to check myself how I respond sometimes. It's a good question. Again, going back to the point earlier, that if that's what they're thinking, that's what they're thinking. So I think it's unhelpful to say, don't think that. So it's being curious around why they're thinking that, and how are they making sense of the situation they're finding themselves in, and offering alternatives. Maybe, would you prefer we did this, or can we think about the situation in this way? And I think if you see themes though, if then there's a regular theme coming up in a certain situation or with certain people, then I think you probably need to step up your intervention, your advice a little bit, and say, look, I'm a bit concerned about you because I'm just noticing these patterns, and have you noticed that yourself? And just explore that with them, because I think as a good friend you would like to think somebody might offer you a nudge if they were concerned about you as well. So I think it's being sensitive, acknowledging that's where they are, but also being brave enough to frame it in a helpful, challenging way if that feels the right thing to do.
I really liked that approach that you suggested as well about being curious
Yeah.
as well, because I think curiosity is a really good thing, and we should all be curious of the world around us. But it's a really nice, non-judgmental approach to take to somebody, with curiosity and open-mindedness, and to try and understand from Becky's friend's perspective, like, why does she think this? Why does she believe this? What's the evidence for this? And exploring that with her, but then also inviting her to be curious and saying, okay, well, I've explored your perception of the world. Are you willing to be curious and explore another perception of the world as well? And so, yeah, it brings, just when you said curious, it made me think that's a really nice way of approaching that problem.
Yeah.
It's getting that move away, isn't it, from a perception of judgment to curiosity. And that's a real balance to get right, isn't it? And how you do that, but a really important move to make as well. So, David, your question. This came in from Louise, and she asked, the developments of artificial intelligence are something I catastrophize about. The speed of the technology moves so fast it worries me. How can I worry less about something which is out of my control?
Oh gosh. this is a really interesting question, Louise, because I, as well as my clinical role, I also co-founded a predictive technology company called Curb, and we use artificial intelligence, but we use it for good because it's incredible. You know, it's a game-changing technology, and I think anything that's new or different, anything that we talked about this earlier, actually anything that's unknown can be quite frightening, because when there's uncertainty, I think all of us can relate to uncertainty being something that's a little bit frightening, because it could be good, it could be bad, we don't know. And if you have a slightly kind of negative pattern of thinking, then you might lean towards thinking about the worst. There's so many things going on in the news right now. Like we talked about climate change, we talked about COVID, like kind of political news going on. There's a lot of things which are overwhelming. I think it's about being mindful with the way that you consume the news, and like Donald talked about earlier, not total avoidance, but also not the other extreme, which is obsessively searching and kind of consuming information constantly. And actually an interesting phenomenon that I've often seen as well, I don't know if either of you have noticed as well, sometimes I have patients who have a really negative view of the world, but they actually prefer to consume media or information which affirms the way that they view the world around them, because it's less jarring than forcing themselves to watch comedy shows, because that's actually quite jarring when you're consuming material which doesn't fit in with how you feel. So I've probably strayed far from the original question. I don't know if I'm the best person to answer that, Louise, because I work with machine learning and AI all the time, and I think it's got the potential for so much good. But I think I understand as well why it's a very frightening topic for some people.
I mean, I think a very, very brave, self-declared bias slightly there. So I'm just going to bring out, Debbie, you got any views on this?
I think it's a really good thing to think about, and I think that there are, like anything, there are pros and cons of any new development. I don't think one person can take responsibility or own that. It's going to be here. So I guess if it's something that somebody's very concerned about, then I guess we need to educate ourselves from the right places around what it actually is and what it's here for and what it's going to do. I think there are some challenges with it. I think there are some good things about it. So you have to decide how much you're going to engage with that information and how much you can influence it or control it. So I guess if you were really interested in it, maybe you go and work in that area, and then you can influence direction of travel, and then you can then have a say in where it goes. Or if you just want to be aware of it, then you expose yourself to it, but in a helpful way from the right sources. Or you find somebody who does know about it and you talk to them about it, and that was an interesting take that you have on it. So again, it's being curious always about what's going on and why am I responding in this way. And it is an unknown, which I think triggers certain reactions in us because we don't know, therefore it's not certain, therefore we have to make assumptions, and therefore what are those assumptions? And that's what we're reacting to, our assumptions. So yeah,
I guess that's about just supporting people to reset that in their thought process as well. And it's probably very important. Point is that all the way through, as technology has advanced, as humanity has advanced, there's always been something that will have caused concern for people. So when you development of electricity, the development of vehicles, the development of flight, all these things have been seen as what next? What's the worry that happens next? So is that just how do you manage that by looking at and almost testing yourself against saying, actually, we had these big advances before, it went okay, or we've managed it and things have happened. So I guess that goes to that catastrophizing piece there. Okay, right. We'll take it away from AI, and I think something that we definitely, most of us know and can understand. So I'm going to come to you for this one, Debbie. This is from Matt, and he says, I really struggle with job interviews because my mind immediately jumps to most negative thought. Like, what if I'm not good enough for the role? It leaves me a bag of nerves in the interview. What advice could you give, Matt?
I think that's a very popular question from Matt, isn't it? And I do a lot of interviews in my role, and we try really hard to kind of people to settle and to kind of feel like a human being rather than anything else. But I think it's your automatic thoughts about yourself that come in terms of your own self-worth. I think it's your predicting what you should say or how amazing I should look in my interview, or do I know all the answers people are going to ask? No, no one ever does. So I think that your thoughts run away with you. And I think what happens is anxiety triggers, your heart rate goes up, your adrenaline and your stress hormones activate, which then makes the chemical balance in your brain become different, and therefore you think differently, and therefore you're going to predict things are going to be bad as a chain reaction. So I think that if people notice that about themselves, it's acknowledging that probably is an anxiety catastrophizing trigger, and therefore how can I manage myself so I don't get caught up in that automatic. So maybe breathing techniques before you go into an interview, maybe talk to someone that you know really well just before you go in, so you're feeling quite jovial, you're feeling very much yourself. Don't overthink, don't over-prepare, just take yourself into the interview rather than I've seen some people, rehearse what they want to say so much that they're almost reading off a piece of paper, and what we're trying to get as an interviewer is actually the human being in front of you, and we don't get that if people are very prepared. So trust that you can take yourself into the room. And if you make a mistake, then just say, actually, that wasn't what I meant. It's okay to make an error or to correct yourself or to say, can I answer that one again? These are just two human beings trying to, sort of progress something, aren't they? So, but I think if you're in that state where your heart rate has gone up, I think it's trying to get your heart rate down, breathe, recognise that can be something that you have to manage. And then again, it's back to the planning of how am I going to prepare myself so I feel a bit calmer, and therefore I can be more myself more in that situation. But it's really common. It's really common.
Yeah. And it's a very interesting one, isn't it, where you have almost one of the best tips I was ever given about it is create it as a conversation.
Right.
It's a structured conversation, and that can be very difficult going into, but actually good interviewers will also do that as well,
yeah.
to create that atmosphere. So it's sometimes about working out as a two-way thing. Mm-hmm. You're giving information, but that person is also got a job and a responsibility to make sure that you feel calm.
I think that's a really good point, Colin, actually. The responsibility shouldn't always sit on the interviewee to make it right. Actually, the person interviewing also has a shared responsibility for that situation you both find yourselves in. So offering a share of responsibility, I think, is a really good mindset to kind of not have that personal responsibility all on your shoulders, because that can trigger anxiety in itself. So I think that's a really good point.
And if I may chip in, really important point to add to that is, if you're being interviewed because they want you, so your potential candidate, they've looked at the application, looked at the CV, and actually maybe you. So you already have a foot in the door.
Right.
So the interview is then to ratify that. There'll always be competition,
yeah.
but the fact that you've been interviewed is a great plus.
Yeah, really good point.
It's a nice way to to reframe some of those kind of negative thoughts before you go into the situation. Because it sounds like, was this chap's name Matt? Matt.
Yeah.
It sounds like a really good example of performance anxiety. Way before I was working in the Priory, I was like a backstage mental well-being concierge for the MTV Europe Awards, and I've worked with sports people as well. And even people at the top of the game experience performance anxiety, and then develop these thoughts like, oh my gosh, everything's going to go wrong. And exactly like Debbie said, this is techniques that they use as well. A couple of deep breaths, switch off that flight or fight by those long deep breaths, stimulating the vagus nerve. But also the other technique that I used in those situations of people getting performance anxiety was visualization exercises, where you imagine that scenario, but you imagine everything going incredibly well. So you could be a gymnast on a balancing beam and you're doing backflips and you're visualizing those backflips landing perfectly. Or you could be a performer at the MTV Music Awards, and the crowd is roaring because they're so enthusiastic about your performance. And again, all of us probably can relate to the experience of feeling a bit nervous talking in front of an audience. But one of the things that I've found works with some of my clients at the Priory group is that if you encourage them to visualize the performance going well, the interview, the board meeting, the talk that you're doing at school, if you visualize that going well, then you almost manifest that, and you present yourself with a degree of confidence that actually invites that positive response back from the people that will be interviewing you or in the audience. So there was lots of things that I liked there, but the breath work, but also the kind of reframing those thoughts and visualizing the kind of response that you want.
Brilliant, thank you. And I hope Matt finds that really helpful. Thank you, David. Thank you for the rest of the panel. That's all we've got time for in this session. So thank you so much for the panel for joining me and offering their expertise on a topic that really affects us all in the modern age. And I think that really came through as a real modern phenomena in many places as well. So if you've enjoyed this discussion, please like this video. We'd really appreciate that. For more of this type of content from Priory and to get future episodes as soon as they drop, please subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching.